Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our conference on this critical issue of the war in Ukraine, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and its major implications and consequences for everything basically in the world, including even maybe some connection between the tomorrow critical election in Israel with the war in Ukraine one way or the other. We do introduce the Israeli subject and element in the Ukraine war, but we'll cover many others, regional and international implications of this war, because indeed this war already having major effects, clarifying to some extent what's going on in our world for better or worse. So it's a great chance to analyze and discuss these issues. So the Center for European and German Studies, as well as the Center for National Security at the University of Haifa, are honored to host this conference, to organize it, and to have you, and to have the great speakers that we have on this panel, as well as in the next panel after 12. So thank you very much for coming in such an early hour in the morning. And now I will allow or transfer the leadership to Katrina, who will be the chair, Katrina from the Center for European and German Studies, and she will introduce the panel and the subjects of the panelists. So looking forward also to your input, questions, and comments. That is more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benny, and welcome everyone also from my side. We're going to have two panels, and it's maybe worthwhile mentioning also this is the second conference we are holding on this topic. We had one already in June, a very similar format, where we really more looked into the effect of the war on economy, on politics. And what we want to do today in the next 4 hours is more to reflect on different perspectives. So we have the Russian perspective, we will have the Ukrainian perspective, we will have a perspective from China, and we will try to understand how this Russian-Ukrainian war affects globally, what kind of impact it has. So this is already the topic of our first panel, the Russia-Ukrainian war and its global effects. We have 4 distinguished speakers on this panel. Each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes, more towards 20 minutes. I will introduce each speaker, and after each speaker delivered his or her speech, we will open for you, for the audience, for questions. So if you come up with a question during one of the talks, please note the question down, and we will keep the last half an hour for open Q&A. It would be also very nice if then you, as the audience, before asking a question, first ask a question, and second introduce yourself so we know with whom are we talking. The conference will be also recorded, so keep this in mind. You can also watch it afterwards online. On this panel, as I said, we have the Russian perspective, we're going to have the Ukrainian perspective, the home front, the local perspective on it, and one that deals with the global effects and the emerging new world order. And our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Feinberg, joining us today from the University of Tel Aviv, also an adjunct of Georgetown University and currently the head of the Great Powers Research Program at Tel Aviv University's Aspire Center for Air and Space Studies. She is a real expert on Russian Middle East policy, and she will enlighten us a little bit on the specific Russian perspective on this topic. So I invite you to come to the panel.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Professor Miller, for inviting me this morning, and to the University of Haifa. I chose, Professor Miller asked me to address the Russian perspective. And if you allow me, I would like to address an overlooked dimension of the Russian perspective, which is the Russian domestic scene. I believe that in the public debate, in the expert community, and especially in Israel, the connection between the domestic scene, the societal and economic resilience of the Russian Federation, and the Putin's shifting strategic goals in Ukraine has been overall overlooked. So I'll start with an observation. You know, Churchill said that generals are always preparing for the wars of the past. And that is true that ironically, what was supposed to be a perfect 21st century war, illustrating the sophistication and the richness of Russian military thought of the past decade, has morphed into a World War II, and I would even say a World War I scenery all over Ukraine. So I would like to address two main topics. First of all, I would like to address how Russia's main strategic objectives have shifted in the past 8 months, and then ask the question if Putin has the breathing space and can afford the kind of attritional war that he has entered into. So when the operation started, Russia pursued 3 main strategic objectives. We speak on February 21st. First of all, dismantle Ukraine as a sovereign political entity and subjugate it to Russia through the well-known rapid plan of deposing Zelensky, replacing him by a pro-Russian puppet regime. Second, limit the Western intervention into that war, including through nuclear blackmailing and the creation of a threat of a refugee crisis in Europe, ensuring the backing of the global South. And 3, strengthens Russia's ability to withstand external pressure, and as part of this effort, to maintain the cohesion of Russian society and the mobilization of Russia behind the war effort. Now we are 8 months after the start of this war, and the strategic objectives remain generally the same, but one major important revision and caveat. And from the war in Syria, you know that Putin is an expert in revising its strategic goals depending on the operational and tactical failures or successes on the ground. So from the objective of deposing the government of Zelensky, the strategic objective moved into the preservation or the consolidation of the territorial gains that Russia made in the past 8 months. Apart from Crimea, that was annexed in 2014, the idea is to preserve at any cost the Luhansk region that was almost entirely conquered, the Donetsk region, which is partly under Russian military control, the Zaporozhye region, and Kherson, that is currently experiencing a major Ukrainian counter-offensive. So now this war for Putin is mainly about securing key strategic and symbolic territorial gains that he will be able to present post-bellum as post-war justifications for this war and create some kind of images of victory. So this is at the strategic level. In the informational space, and Dr. Tabachnik is expert on this issue, we're seeing a reshifting of this war that we identified in late March and early April after the catastrophic retreat from Kiev and the repositioning of Russian troops to the south. From a surgical, modern, sophisticated blitzkrieg, this war has explicitly turned into a protracted war of attrition. So the Russian theoretical framing of that war is that of a war of attrition from a Crimea-style operation we've moved into a kind of replay of 1941. So now very clearly, this is a protracted war for which all of Russian resources, including societal resources, economic resources, all of remaining military capabilities, including non-conventional ones, should be deployed for an indefinite period of time. So this is a major reshifting of this war, and this is what prompted many to leave Russia, to quit Russia, even before the partial mobilization of September this year. Incidentally, in Russian official discourses, the war has shifted from a quick and rational war to a Manichaean framing of this war, which is syncretic in nature. On the one hand, it borrows from the epic rhetoric of the Great Patriotic War. On the other, and we know that the Christian Orthodox Church is a full institution of the Putin's war machine, it has moved into a war between the forces of light and the Antichrist. So this war is between Nazification and desatanization. There is a messianic shift in Russian rhetoric that should be followed very, very closely, given the elective affinities between the Christian Orthodox Church and the nuclear domain in Russia, as was clearly shown by Professor Dima Adamski. So given this new strategic and informational shift, the question is, can Putin really sustain a war of attrition from a domestic perspective? Does he have a long breathing space from the point of view of the resistance of Russian society to accept that war and from an economic point of view? And here I would like to make 3 points. Putin has conducted a very good job at engineering societal cohesion, not because its propaganda campaign is excellent. He has invested a lot in informational warfare, which is the central part of, which is the central instrument that Russia has used both domestically and in Ukraine, and we can talk about this. But mainly, he has done so through the complete annihilation of the liberal opposition. You have more than 500 political prisoners today in Russia, more than 19,000 administrative cases, 4,000 penal cases. The major political figures opposing that war are in prison or exiled. The only freely circulating opposition figures are the lawyers of the political prisoners. And this is critical. You know, a few years ago, I worked in the human rights organization Memorial, and we understood that the opposition to war doesn't come from grassroots movements. It comes from the political liberal parties. And currently, they are completely annihilated. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the radical revisionist criticism of the war, mainly led by two prominent figures. One of them is Prigozhin, which is the head of the Wagner mercenary group, and the other one is Ramzan Kadyrov, which is the head of the Republic of Chechnya. And in the past few weeks, their rhetorics have changed. They've been vocally critical of the war, but what is very important to keep in mind is that they're not critical of the rationale of this war. They've been critical of the mismanagement of this war. So for them, the criticism was a way to promote the political position in the security establishment and in Putin's inner circle, but in a way they've played the old tactic of the systemic opposition in Russia, whose role is to create an impression of free debate, of resistance, of opposition, but whose result is to present the regime of Putin as humanist, rational, and a preferable option to the crazy option of the radical revisionists. So from the liberal opposition point of view, Putin doesn't have any challenge at the moment. And from the radical revisionist opposition, Putin is receiving some kind of backing, because this opposition presents him as not responsible for the war. The defense establishment is responsible for the mismanagement of the war, and presents him as a rational person compared to the nuclear madness of those two figures. In terms of engineering the lack of resistance, there is a mystery in terms of the civilian population relationship, reaction to that war. If we take the statistics of the Haifa Center, which is considered to be a foreign agent in Russia, we see that over 75% of the Russian public still supports this war. But if we go further, we see that this support goes hand in hand with frustration, anxiety, feelings of guilt, feelings of humiliation, or justifications, attempts to justify Russia's behavior in Ukraine through different narratives that do present Russia in a positive way. So meaning that the Russian public is behaving not as citizens but as subjects. It comes from a long tradition of detachment from the political sphere that we've seen during the Soviet period in the 1960s and 70s. So there is a great apathy in Russian society that goes hand in hand with the emergence of what we call stealth resistance. Instead of going to the streets to protest the war, you've noticed many acts of sabotage, acts of defection from conscripts. So you have this kind of low-level stealth resistance, which is important to mention because the first mobilization wave created a shock in Russian society in September and prompted many to leave Russia. Now we are at the eve of the regular conscription period, which will start on November 1st until December 31st. Should Russia proceed with new waves of mobilization alongside the regular conscription period, it could amplify those niches of stealth resistance inside the Russian Federation, and the regime is very aware of this. Putin is constantly declaring that the mobilization is over, that it is the end. The mayor of Moscow also put a great emphasis on this. Last and not least, we have growing signs of despair in Russian society. Actually, there was a raise of 70% in the consumption of antidepressants in Russian society. So it is a good indication of the potential of morphing into some kind of a long-term resistance. At the end, so when we analyze the societal resistance of Russian society, we do see that Putin, yes, can lead an attrition war, and we have the public behind it, especially because of the self-serving encouragement of immigration. You know that you've had a mass immigration of some 900,000 Russians leaving to Kazakhstan and other countries. The numbers are not clear until the end. And the regime has been extremely lenient towards this immigration because this is a way to calm down the centers of resistance inside the Russian Federation and to mobilize all the security apparatus to the war in Ukraine. The last point I want to make is about the effects of sanctions. The problem of sanctions, and we know it with Iran, is that they do have a sequential and deferred effect. In the immediate period, actually the sanctions have not harmed Russia significantly in terms of its fiscal revenues, in terms of its GDP, which contracted to 3.6% only, according to the last assessment of the IMF. So Putin is right when he says that Russia has the economic resources to continue leading this war of attrition in Ukraine. Just to open up, in the short term, of course, in the long term, this is a debate that we can have. So just to open up, I've addressed here in front of you just the societal and economical resilience that Russia enjoys at the moment in the coming months to pursue this war of attrition in Ukraine. There are two other key elements that we can talk about in a Q&A. First, the continuity of the neutrality or the passive support of the global south. To what extent will China, India, and other countries continue play into that balancing game and keep the position of relative neutrality vis-à-vis Russia? And second, and most importantly, which is related to Russia's ability to sustain that war from the point of view of its human resources sent to Ukraine, their overall quality and efficiency, and from the point of view of its arsenal of systems and weapons sent to Ukraine, and in particular the precision-guided weapons and systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feinberg. You kept the time perfectly well, and for kind of giving us an inside perspective of what's going on in Russia, also how society is thinking. So that fits very well because our next perspective will be the Ukrainian perspective. We have here with us Dr. Alexander Tabachnik, a postdoctoral researcher here at the School of Political Science. And I think it's going to be very interesting now to have a counter perspective. So I invite you to the podium to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So I will try to present the Ukrainian perspective. And first of all, we try to ask the three major questions, of course, from the Ukrainian perspective. How can we define the purposes of a Russian intervention from the Ukrainian perspective? Why does Ukrainian resistance to Russia's intervention in Ukraine look so different in 14 and 22? And what are the major strategies of the Ukrainian government in confrontation with Russia? Of course, here I will discuss only excluding the military component and what are the major weaknesses of Ukraine. I would prefer to start from of how Putin defines Ukraine and generally how Russian elite groups define Ukraine and generally Ukrainian people. The Russian and Ukrainian people are practically one nation, Putin said in 14. We here can also see how Putin's vision of Ukraine evolved. Those people who lived historically on today's territory of Ukraine called themselves Russians in 19. Modern Ukraine was entirely and completely created by Russian, he said earlier this year. Soviet Ukraine is the result of Bolshevik policy and can be rightly called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. Ukraine sovereignty is a gift that Moscow may take back. So we can see that actually Putin and generally a Russian elite group deny existence of Ukraine as independent state, and generally they deny existence of Ukrainian people as distinct ethnic or nation group. So from Ukrainian perspective, we can generally define two general perspectives. From a first perspective, Russia strives for complete extermination of Ukraine and Ukrainians as a state and nation. Of course, not physically, but from ideological perspective through a process of Russification. In this case, Ukrainians understand that Russia strives to seize almost all territory of Ukraine, maybe with some exception of Western Ukraine. And the second plan of Novorossiya. According to Russian leadership, this territory was never part of Ukraine, and as we can see now, Russia tries to conduct in this territory intensive Russification and incorporation into Russia. Of course, in this case, from Ukrainian perspective, the rest of Ukrainian territory will collapse from economic and demographic perspective, and also Russia in different ways tries to instigate Polish, Romanian, and Hungarian revisionism in order to take some western part of Ukraine. So now on these maps, we can see how, from Ukrainian perspective, Russia tries to actually destroy Ukraine. We can see that Russia tries to establish on Ukrainian territory about 8 independent republics, and later these republics will be incorporated inside Russia. Important to mention that population of these regions, you can see on the map, comprise about 45% of Ukrainian population, and on the right map you can see the territory comprise about 45% of Ukrainian territory, but very important to mention that on these territories concentrated most of Ukrainian economic power, I mean different plants, etc. So in both cases, from Ukrainian perspective, Russia strives to destroy Ukraine. Now, if we want to understand why a war in 14 and now looks different, we should first understand how Ukraine is built from ethnic, linguistic, and political perspective. You can see on the map what eastern region of Ukraine and Crimea populated by significant Russian majority. If in Crimea, ethnic Russian majority comprises almost 60%, but in Donetsk or Luhansk regions, ethnic Russians comprise only 40%, but this enough to sustain some kind of separatist movement. Overall, we can see that if we compare with the map of Novorossiya, we can see that territory that Russia tries to take to itself more or less suits to this map, where a Russian ethnic minority comprises significant percent of the local population. Next, linguistic composition. We can see that eastern part of Ukraine is mostly populated by Russian-speaking people. Important to mention that many ethnic Ukrainians over years undergone a process of Russification. So from cultural perspective, many of them use Russian language as their first language. Next, from political point of view, Eastern Ukraine historically voted mostly for pro-Russian candidates. You can see here election from 10, when Eastern Ukraine voted from Viktor Yanukovych, who is pro-Russian candidate, and Yulia Tymoshenko, who is a pro-Western candidate. You can see that Eastern Ukraine voted mostly for pro-Russian candidate. So, in 2014, Ukraine could be defined as a very weak state from a point of view of national consolidation and organizational perspective. Ukrainian population generally comprised about 45 million people, but also very significant Russian ethnic minority, which was concentrated mostly in Crimea and in eastern part of Ukraine. So in 14, Ukraine could be defined as a very heterogeneous state from political, ethnic, and language perspective. That this fact simplified Russian seizure of Crimea and of course destabilization of eastern Ukraine. Also because of organizational and national weakness, Ukrainian army was easily defeated by pro-Russian formation in eastern Ukraine in 14. But following Russian seizure of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, Ukraine undergone some process of ethnic and linguistic homogenization that allowed to Kiev to start some kind of nation-building process. Of course, under very heavy support of Western countries, also economic support and political support, and also general Ukrainian population could see that Russia completely failed to sustain some appropriate level of economic or socio-economic development in Lugansk and Donetsk regions which were under Russian control. So generally Ukrainian population, also people who previously supported Russia, could see that Russia could not suggest some alternative to the West. Result. Intensification of process of nation and state building in Ukraine after 14, reformation, enhancement of army and security services. We can see results on the ground. Of course, very significant Western support, financial, political, and military, and enhancement of different government structures. Of course, Ukraine remains relatively weak and corrupted state, but anyway we can see some improvement, and of course gradual integration in different European structures. Now, how Ukrainian government tries to confront with Russia? First of all, the main Ukrainian message: if Russia will not be stopped in Ukraine, it will continue in the Baltic states, and generally it will intensify its efforts directed toward destabilization of the Western countries, the EU and NATO. And of course, Ukraine says that if West now do not support Ukraine, Western deterrence capabilities will be undermined, and of course countries like China, Iran look for this situation and they will act accordingly if West will not support Ukraine. So China will move toward Taiwan, and Iran also will intensify its efforts to destabilize Middle East. So, of course, Ukraine also applied to legal and normative perspectives. And, of course, Ukraine tried to unite West in the face of Russian intervention and receive significant political, military, and financial support. Also, Ukrainian government and general Ukrainian population hope that Russia, which undergoes very significant economic, demographic, and crisis. Also, we can see organizational weakness. So Russia will not be able to stand a prolonged confrontation with collective West. Also, Russia heavily depends on Western technologies and Western markets. So Ukrainian government hopes that under very difficult socioeconomic conditions in Russia, depopulation and immigration, Russian government will be forced to go back with its demands. Also, we can see that Ukraine, I can see surprising, succeed to manage very successful information warfare against Russia. Ukrainians tries to split Russian society according to the ethnic lines. We should remember that Russia is a multi-ethnic country without some state perfectly defined ideology. So Ukrainian government and different its structures try to direct appeal to different ethnic minority groups Russia in order to destabilize it. We also should mention that Russian government prefer to take in its army mostly ethnic minority from Chechnya, from Dagestan, from Far East. So because of this region, Ukrainian government applies directly to this minorities and says that they die for Russia and Russian world, despite the fact that they do not belong to this world. Also, Ukraine tries to use the weakness of Putin regime, such as corruption, low efficacy, stratification of society. Russian society can be separated in extremely rich and very poor. So Ukraine tries to use this fact. But also Ukraine characterized by some difficulties. Inflation in high prices in Europe, very high cost of military equipment that West sends to Russia, and of course very expensive direct economic support. So we cannot know how much time West will continue to support Ukraine at this level. Also, we can mention demographic problems in Ukraine and very limited resources. And of course, we can mention recent massive Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Apparently, Russian government strives to inflict heavy damage to Ukrainian infrastructure and cause to millions of Ukrainians to move to Europe and of course destabilize and Europe and Ukraine. And the last point, additional weakness from my perspective, Ukrainian nationalism, ethnic nationalism, which could arise, and very problematic new heroes from the past, such as Bandera, Shohevich, organization like OUN, UPA, which were involved in war crimes in the period of the Second World War. They were involved in physical extermination of the Jews and Polish people, and now this organization people become heroes. And I suppose that from European perspective, from Israeli perspective, this is a very problematic issue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tabachnik, for also taking us a little bit back in history. And I think it's very important to reflect on what was in 2014, the split between East and West, and what is today. Our next speaker, Professor Michael Gross, coming from the University of Haifa, professor at the School of Politics, former head of the School of Politics, and he will present us an inside perspective. What about Israel and the big debate? Should Israel send weapons to the Ukraine? If yes, what kind, for how long? So I very much welcome you to this stage, and I think it's also a very good topic for the upcoming elections in the next day. Maybe it will have effect, so welcome to the panel.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you, Benny, and everyone for the invitation. I'm very happy to address you on this question. Should Israel sell weapons to Ukraine? It speaks to one of Alexander's points. Will the West continue to support Ukraine? So these questions are tied together. Let me start with this. Let's see how this works. This was a question that was floated among a sample of Israelis about 2 weeks ago. In your opinion, should Israel provide weapons to Ukraine despite Russia's warning not to do so? You have 3 answers: agree, disagree, or don't know. And I'm going to ask you to vote. Otherwise, no lunch. How many people agree? Come on. One, okay. How many people disagree? Oh, good. How many people don't know? Okay, what did our compatriots say? 21% said yes, 41% said no, and 38% just don't know. I'm actually with the 38% because this is a very, very difficult question to unravel, to figure out, and for the benefit of the 38% and anybody else here who really doesn't know, what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is lay out some of the issues or the criteria for deciding not so much whether we should sell arms to Ukraine. This isn't really our decision as individuals. Our decision is, should we support or oppose our government's decision to sell or not sell arms to Ukraine? So it's a secondary kind of question, but the issue is the same. So I want to just lay out a few criteria that come to mind when I think about this question, put them before you that might allow some of these people, most of the people who don't know, to try to make up their minds. In general, why do we give weapons to another state? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is a contractual alliance, right? NATO or some other alliance in the world where nations are obligated by treaty, by contract, to give arms, weapons, sometimes soldiers, to another country. That's not the case here, as we know. Then we have all kinds of geopolitical interests, which usually revolve around self-defense, economic interests, and that's a lot of what's going on now. One country has an interest to support another country in a struggle, an armed struggle in this case, against another country because of its own geopolitical interests. Another is our humanitarian interests. We do it because the country that needs our help, because on the horizon, or in fact, are grave human rights violations. And we also see that in Ukraine, of course. Very often these things are mixed. As you see, I gave the same example for geopolitical interests, US aid to Israel in 1973, and humanitarian interests. So these are never clear-cut categories, but there's a mix. Some are more geopolitical, some are more humanitarian. When we look at humanitarian, the interests are laid out in a doctrine that began to emerge about 20 years ago called R2P, the responsibility to protect, to help another country that faces aggression, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Aggression is defined very specifically in a legal sense as the use of force by one state against another in violation of the UN Charter. The UN Charter allows one country to use force against another country in self-defense. If it's used for reasons other than self-defense, it's an illegitimate use of force, and it's aggression. So the point I want to make here, without going into too much detail, is that the obligation to help another country weakens. It gets weaker as we go down this list. So when contractual issues are at stake, it's very important, but when humanitarian issues are at stake, the obligation to help becomes weaker. Why does it become weaker? Well, this is a well-known, I think well-recognized intuition or even theory in moral philosophy that we have an obligation to help someone insofar as it doesn't create an unreasonable burden on ourselves. So we go by a burning house, someone needs to be saved. We have an obligation to help that person who needs to be saved, only as far as the cost that it imposes upon ourselves is not unreasonable or too great. What reasonable means, what unreasonable means is debatable, but in many cases like this, we don't have an obligation to risk our very lives to help another person who is in need. So the point I want to make here is this obligation to help sell weapons gets weaker as the humanitarian cause replaces the geopolitical cause. Second question is, how strong are our duties to help? In other words, we're trying to help someone, but help them do what? And one of the things I didn't hear, which I'm going to ask the other panelists maybe during the Q&A, is what does Ukraine want? What do they want to get out of this war? Do they want to defend their citizens from attack? Do they want to restore the status quo antebellum before the war? Do they want to recover East Ukraine, the provinces that you saw up on the map before? Or do they want to recover Crimea? What Ukraine wants is very important in our decision to supply them arms. And here too, I think you'll understand that as the Ukrainian demands become greater and less vital, the obligation to provide arms weakens. So if they're trying to defend their citizens from attack, from grave human rights abuses, from attacks on civilians, then the obligation is greater. But if the Ukrainians are coming along and saying, yes, but we also want to recover East Ukraine, we also want to recover Crimea, then our obligation in the West, in Israel, becomes weaker. So what I've showed you now are there's two forces, or two considerations, that weaken our obligation. The more humanitarian aid is needed, the weaker it becomes in contrast to geopolitical, and the less vital Ukrainian goals are, in our eyes, the weaker our obligation to aid becomes. So now what do we do? Well, now we begin to think about how we analyze or how we respond to Ukrainian requests for weapons. So let's assume we've reached a decision that there is some reason here to give them weapons. Well, the first question is, are the weapons effective to achieve whatever goal they're after here, aiding civilians, for example? Second question is are there no other means to achieve the same goal at a lower cost? We know, for example, from living in Israel, that one of the best defenses against missile attacks is civil defense. That's why we develop shelters. That's why we develop in every house there's some sort of bomb shelter. Israel puts an enormous amount of money, technology, into civil defense as one of the second lines, perhaps, against missile and other armed attacks. So maybe there's a recourse there. Maybe there's a solution there that instead of giving them arms, we can improve civil defense, early warning systems, and the kinds of things that you've read about in the press. Then we start talking about, and here it gets tricky, costs and benefits. What are the costs and benefits of providing aid, arms aid? The costs and benefits can be financial, right? They can be military. It can cost a lot of money. There can be military costs and benefits, and there can be public opinion costs and benefits. So what we do and have to do, or more precisely, what we need to demand from our policymakers and our leaders, is to tell us what are the costs and benefits, but not just in vague terms, but in terms of how important these are, this we call magnitude, and how probable it's going to be that something is going to happen that we may not want to happen. So for example, one of the comments that has been publicized lately, if Israel supplies arms, whatever kind of arms, to Ukraine, Russia will provide advanced missile defense systems to Iran. Okay, what do I do with that statement? I have two questions. One, how important or how dangerous is it for Israel if tomorrow Iran gets Russian air defense systems? Is that a big deal or not? I don't know. But someone in the defense establishment has to tell me and give me that information so I can make a decision. Let's assume it's moderately important. It's a threat of some sort that we need to take into account. What's the probability that this is going to happen? We hear all kinds of threats all the time. I opened up this session with a question that hinged on a threat, right? Israel will regret, the Russians will make all kinds of problems for Israel if they do this. Is that really going to happen? Can we judge by Russian behavior in the past whether they're serious, whether they're not serious, whether they're a little bit serious? So I need, as a citizen, I need that information. And only with that information can I address the question what to sell or give Ukraine. Then we get into this whole question here about which weapons. For those of you who follow the debate, it's all about missile defense systems, which seem to be synonymous with Iron Dome, although not quite synonymous. Iron Dome, by the way, the technology aside, whoever thought of that name deserves a prize. Because the idea, look at the other names, Iron Beam, Barak, Patriot, David Sling. Iron Dome has created the impression, maybe true, maybe not true, that there's this system in Israel that functions like a big force field, you know, like from Star Wars or from Star Trek. You put it around the whole country, and we're protected from everything. So when the Ukrainians say, or anybody else says Iron Dome, what they mean is usually some aspect of Israel's total missile defense system. But again, if you followed the press a little bit, you'll see that all of these systems have some reservations. We're getting this information from the press, we're getting a little bit from the government, but this is the kind of information we need in greater detail, to make a decision about whether to support arms sales. So the Iron Dome, we hear, is not effective in a place like Ukraine because it only covers a small area. Iron Beam, which is really cool, laser beams, it's in a developmental stage. It's not yet operational. Barak 8 is operational. The Indians have it. We've given it to Azerbaijan. They're not going to give it to the Russians. The Indians are neutral, and Azerbaijan is sitting in Russia's backyard. So maybe Israel should give them that. It just became operational, though, a few months ago. Is it suitable? Is it not suitable? Is it effective? Is it cost-effective? Information that we need. The Patriots, David Sling, Arrow, you can look these up. These are all intermediate missile defense systems. They come with a big string attached, and that string is the United States of America. Patriot's a U.S. system. David Sling, Arrow are U.S. funded. The U.S. can provide these systems. The U.S. can give Patriots tomorrow, and they don't, for reasons of their own. They have not necessarily acquiesced or given Israel any kind of indication that they will support providing these systems to Ukraine. Israel's bearing the brunt of the public relations issue, but behind the scenes, we know that there's a formal requirement that America sign off, and there's also an issue where the United States has its own reasons for not necessarily providing these weapon systems. So what do we do? One thing that you need to do as a, I think, concerned and informed citizen is to look at the different debates and try to understand them in the context of the decision-making framework that I've tried to lay out here. So for example, if you've caught the papers the last couple of days, there was a headline in the American media, "Progressive Democrats urge Joe Biden to shift strategy and directly engage with Russia." What they said was the United States should support Ukraine, but the United States should also be more proactive about negotiations. This received a huge amount of publicity, and the letter was rescinded the very next day. The progressives backed off. But the debate is out there. We know it's out there. We hear it in Israel. We hear it from public opinion polls in the United States. We hear it from public opinion polls in Russia, in Europe. People are beginning to say, what's the end game? Where are we going with this? And it's not only about energy costs in the coming winter. The question is, how long is this going to go on for? What do the Ukrainians want from us at the end of the day? The Democrats, the progressive Democrats, made a move. They hit a stone wall, a lot of resistance from the public. They backed off. But what's going on here is that Ukrainian goals are stipulated, moderate Ukrainian goals, as a condition of giving aid, of receiving aid. Beyond Iron Dome, Ukrainian desperately wants advanced Israeli systems. That was the point I just discussed. The issue on the table here, what about effectiveness? Which issues will do the job? Which weapons are necessary? Zelensky slams Israel, suggests Russia will help Iran with its nuclear program. Zelensky's emphasizing the military benefits of Israel supplying weapons. Okay, same question. What's the risk that Russia will supply Iran with, or help Iran with its nuclear program? What does that mean? What does it mean for Israel? What's the probability that this is going to happen? This is information that we need to evaluate Zelensky's claim. Time to take a side. U.S. lawmakers push Israel on aid to Ukraine. What they're emphasizing is a political cost of not supplying weapons. This is the public relations angle. So there's military costs, maybe, of supplying weapons that Israel's trying to evaluate. Those military costs are that the Russians may help the Iranians, but there's also a political cost of not supplying weapons. We have to be able to evaluate this. What is the political cost? Are the Americans going to turn their backs on Israel? Are the Americans just going to deflect criticism from their own decisions not to sell certain advanced weaponry to Ukraine back onto Israel? There's a very complicated game going on here that the public has to be aware of. And then the statement that I opened up with, Israel giving arms to Ukraine will destroy ties with Russia. Political and military costs of supplying weapons. So we have benefits of supplying weapons, we have costs of not supplying weapons, we have costs of supplying weapons. All this has to be sorted out. We can sort it out only on the basis of what our political leaders, policymakers, tell us. Our goal, or the course of action that we might take is to press for this information and not get it in little bits and pieces as we tend to see it. It's the responsibility of the government, some of us in academia, to supply citizens with this information so they can make an answer, so they can reach an answer. So I'm not going to give you an answer. I can't give you an answer because I, like many of you, don't know because I don't have the information I need. I don't have the information regarding, as I mentioned, necessity. Are there alternative means that Israel can provide Ukraine? It seems that there might be, in terms of passive air and civil defense, in terms of civil defense, in terms of maybe deterrence options, maybe alternative suppliers, maybe others can provide this in a way that won't put Israel in a position where it has to bear certain costs that are not evenly distributed or not costs that we want to take on upon ourselves. Are they effective? Are they useful? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? And finally, are the Ukrainian requests tenable in the sense that we still don't know and need to know what they're after, what they want? And once we know that, we can begin to evaluate our response, understanding that the more the Ukrainians want, the less obligated Israel and the West is to support them beyond protecting their own citizens and meeting grave human rights abuses, as we know are occurring in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gross. It was a really good insight, also from kind of a European or German perspective, especially what you said about the Iron Dome. If those of you following the European or the German press, also Europe, also Germany wants to purchase the Iron Dome with very little understanding, what does it help, what does it not help? And now, last but not least, we have our fourth speaker, Professor Benny Miller, co-organizer or organizer of this conference, Professor of International Relations at the School of Political Science and the Director of the National Security Center here at the university. And you will try to kind of sum this panel a little bit up and reflect on the global effects and what is the emerging new world order that will come out of this conflict. I will bring your PowerPoint up.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And after all these great presentations,
This is yours? No. That's your presentation, no? Is this yours?
it's oh, yeah, this one. Okay, so my question that I will try to address is what are the implications of the Ukraine war for the international order? The Ukraine war both shows us many important aspects of the international order, but it also has major effects on the world order. Kind of, let me say first, kind of a bottom line. There are three major forces that are actually competing in the world order, as well as the Ukraine war. Realpolitik, kind of power and security, liberalism, both democracy and the liberal international order that the United States established after World War II in the West, and then try to expand it after the end of the Cold War to the rest of the world, and nationalism. Liberalism shows, I think, its great strengths in the West, even though with some major limitation, as we'll try to point out. However, beyond the West, the liberal factors, the liberal mechanism didn't show their power, and they actually show their major limits. Realpolitik, power and security seems to be kind of underlying and present the context for the war, most notably the power transition that is taking place in the world, with the shift from a unipolar world dominated by one superpower, the United States, to a multipolar world, namely a world in which there are few great powers balancing each other, competing with each other, and most notably and most importantly by far is the US-China rivalry, which is the key issue that is defining our world presently and into the future. But Russia also plays some role, and definitely the Ukraine war showed its role, for better or worse, especially for worse. Finally, about nationalism, I think from a kind of ideational point of view, it shows its great power in this conflict, kind of helping us to understand the motivations of both parties and show their huge power of nationalism. For better, maybe, in the sense of defensive nationalism, like in the case of Ukraine, but also the awful negative implication of nationalism in the case of offensive nationalism in the case of Russia. Let me start with the key element, the realpolitik element of the great power rivalry. The great power rivalry kind of shaping our world started in the second decade of the 21st century. After over 2 decades of American dominance and American trying to shape the international order with some successes, but with some major failures, now we have a completely different world. And definitely this power transition is a key component that led to this war, at least in the belief of Putin, that under this power transition, it's much easier to try to expand Russian power, including by occupying territories beyond the borders of Russia, as they were determined after the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. Before the war, what we had is definitely the US-China competition. It's still the most important element in the world order. However, Russia, mostly in destabilizing effects, joined this competition, and as opposed to China, even though China also became very aggressive, for example, in the maritime dispute in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea in the last few years, Russia obviously demonstrated its revisionism, its aspiration to change the current international borders, the borders that were shaped after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, by the use of force on land, not only in maritime dispute, and especially important in Europe, the continent that symbolized supposedly the era of peace after 1945, after kind of the lessons of the Second World War. What are the implications of the great power rivalry for Israel? Actually, it puts Israel in a very uncomfortable situation between the US, China, and Russia. Obviously, the US is the most important for Israel, is critical for Israel's security and actually for Israel's survival. It's providing the security umbrella. It's a strategic ally of Israel, even if informally in some sense. On the other hand, China, Israel and China did develop important economic and technological relations in the last few years, which are important for Israel's economic and technological development. And Russia, obviously, since November 2015, became our neighbor on the Golan Heights, or in Syria. And Israel, according to foreign sources, and not only foreign sources, when Israel bombing Iranian-related targets in Syria, has to take into account potential Russian reaction. And definitely that's the key consideration why Israel didn't provide yet arms to Ukraine, at least thus far, apart from some limited humanitarian assistance. What about the United States and the Ukraine war? Before the war, we had the process of American disengagement. Obviously, President Trump symbolized this process in a major way. America first, America taking care of only of its immediate, narrow interest. It doesn't care about what's going on in the world beyond its immediate economic and security interest. President Biden came to power with supposedly completely different agenda. However, to some extent, until the Ukraine war, he continued this process, and it culminated in August of last year with the withdrawal, the hectic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which indicated, to some extent, growing American isolationism, at least with regard to the Middle East, the greater Middle East, in which the United States had all these failures of the intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq and all what happened as a result of that. But also, to some extent, disengagement from Europe, not from the Indo-Pacific, not from East Asia. That remain also in Trump, but definitely in Biden, as the key international engagement of the United States. But Middle East, and to some extent Europe, supposedly decline in their importance. This completely changed after February 24th, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, especially with regard to Europe. Definitely, the United States is now heavily engaged in the Ukraine war, both with imposing unprecedented heavy economic sanction on Russia, as well as providing tens of billions of military and economic aid to Ukraine. And as we'll talk about NATO, the whole revival of the Western alliance, which was in under big question mark before the war, completely changed after the war. What about the Middle East? It's the arena that is closely related to Israel interests. So supposedly, if we can kind of rank the different regions in American preferences and priorities, we can say East Asia, Indo-Pacific, most important, Europe secondly, and more important after the Russian invasion. The Middle East may be the third most important arena, obviously after the failures of the post-9/11 intervention in Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. But still, the Middle East forces its important, its relevant, at least with regard to two factors. One is nuclear proliferation, that actually this subject became more important after the Ukraine war because of the, as we talk about, hopefully, the nuclear taboo and what happened with the Putin threats after the war broke out. Obviously, the nuclear proliferation with regard to Iran and potentially with other states in the region is a critical issue. And secondly, energy. Suddenly, oil and gas became very important and critical again. So the Biden administration had completely to reverse its policy versus the pariah state and the pariah prince in Saudi Arabia, that the United States under Biden, completely different from Trump, stated initially that Saudi Arabia is a pariah and they will boycott Mohammed bin Salman, the actual leader of Saudi Arabia. But after the war broke out, an energy supply, especially to Europe, but also the market prices that also affect America and the rising inflation in the United States, especially on the eve of the midterm elections next week, the United States the Biden administration changed its policy, and Biden came to visit Saudi Arabia in June. Now, again, the Biden administration has to reconsider because Saudi Arabia and Russia agreed with other OPEC members on reduction of the oil production in order to increase prices. So the Biden administration became disappointed again from Saudi Arabia. But anyway, it does show that the Middle East, because of proliferation, because of energy, is still very important, despite the inclination of the United States to disengage from this region, to forget about it after all what happened in the last 20 years from the American perspective. What is the character of the international system? Is it a system of peace or a system of war? Here, a major change took place after the Russian invasion. Before the war, at least in the West, but maybe even beyond the West, there was a growing belief in the so-called new peace. What was this new peace based upon? It was based on the idea that there is a universal acceptance of the international norm of territorial integrity, namely that states will not resort to force in order to change their boundaries and to take over territories from the neighbors. It looks like that they're almost, especially, let's say, since the Gulf War, since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, there were almost no violation of this norm. And even then, in the Gulf War, almost the whole world stood together against Iraq. So it looked like this acceptance of this norm guarantees an era of peace. Most notably in Europe, obviously, that after the lessons of World War II and so on, seemed like the continent of peace. This change, obviously, after the Ukraine invasion, it basically shows the fundamental character of the international system that still didn't change. The international system is anarchic. Is anarchic in the sense that there is no world government, that there is no universal global supplier of security to all the states in the international system. In this sense, it's a self-help system. So if we look at the case of Ukraine, on the one hand, there is major Western assistance to Ukraine. Obviously, we cannot dismiss this assistance. Military supply, including more and more sophisticated weapons, especially recently after the Ukraine military victories, and also economic assistance and heavy economic sanctions on Russia. However, the West doesn't send troops to Ukraine to protect Ukraine against the Russian invasion. It's basically Ukrainian. Apart from maybe a few volunteers from here and there, it's basically the Ukrainian that have to fight for their own independence against the Russian aggressor. And secondly, even the idea of no flying zones that was raised at the beginning of the war was turned down by the West, and the NATO was unwilling to implement it. And basically, the Ukrainians have to protect themselves, again, with important assistance, but still, it's a self-help system. And what we have now, right now, in Europe is, the first time after 1945, a major land warfare that we didn't imagine. It's actually the most notable case of a land warfare in the world, the international system, since 1945. Maybe a little bit comparable is what happened in 1973 in Israel with major tank and artillery warfare. But the war in Ukraine is actually much more intense than that, and obviously takes much longer. It has both at least some war of movement, but also a war of attrition. And the role of artillery, for example, that was on the whole overlooked in military calculation in recent decades, became again crucial element of this warfare. Now actually initially favoring Russia, now actually favoring Ukraine because of the supply of quite very sophisticated artillery pieces by the West, especially the United States, to Ukraine. And also we have a major, obviously, the bombing of civilian targets on a major scale that we didn't see really since 1945. What the implication for Israel? We can say that Israel fits this kind of new era, at least to some extent. Israel presents supposedly a national security model. It's almost the only country in the West, maybe apart from Finland, that has conscription that supposedly, now it's not everyone, but supposedly everyone that reaches 18 years old, more or less, has to go to military service, and that doesn't exist in most of the Western country. Israel also developed arms, very developed, sophisticated arms industry, but still there are a lot of questions about Israel and the implication of the war for Israel. Is Israel ready for major land force? There are a lot of questions about the capabilities of Israeli land forces in recent years that weren't really tested, and if they were tested, there were some question marks. And the question of war of attrition, and especially in the case of bombing civilian population, civilian center. Is Israel ready for it? And that poses some major potential challenges to Israel. Alliances that are still show themselves to be very important part of the world order. NATO. Before the war, it looked like NATO is moribund, that it's really becoming more and more irrelevant, division among NATO countries, inside NATO countries. That changed, at least until now, in some major ways after the breakout of the war. NATO, with some important question marks about the future, but still, at least for the last most recent 8 months, NATO showed its unity and its ability to work together on the whole in major arms supply to Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. However, there is this tension between the peace camp versus the justice camp. Wow. Okay. The justice camp includes the UK and the Baltic states and Poland are completely committed to a full-blown defeat of Russia and to complete a Ukrainian victory, including taking back Crimea, versus the peace camp that includes most notably Germany and to some extent France, that have some question marks about when this war will end, under what conditions, and the important costs that the Europeans are playing, especially in the rising energy costs, the inflation, and so there are some questions. And also internally in a few states, most importantly by far the United States, there is a growing division. It looked like initially, I wanted to cover the issue of polarization that is now critically important for the West, what's going on not only in Israel, but in all Western countries, the polarization between nationalist populism and the liberal forces, most importantly in the United States. And next week we have the midterm election that are very important test of this polarization. But for the implication of that for the Ukraine war is that actually, even though initially America seems to be standing more or less united with Ukraine, with some economic sanction and with arms supply, now we see the growing cleavages. On the one hand, we have the nationalist populists now dominating the Republican Party in the United States that are actually have a lot of question marks. And McCarthy, supposedly the future leader of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives after the election, if they indeed, as it looks like, will win the election, say that they will not provide blank check to Ukraine, as supposedly the Biden administration did. And as Michael noted, also on the other side, the opposite side of the political equation in the United States, the progressive, there was this letter that they rescinded after 1 day, more or less, but still, this letter did show that also in the radical left in the United States, there are some question marks about the cost for the United States. Still, until this point, we can say the West is more united than what we expected in support for Ukraine, and it does show, I think, the power of liberalism in the West. But maybe, let me, because of time limitation, let me say, maybe respond to the last, to this question. I have many other elements to cover, but okay, we don't have time. The question about, is the world becoming more united or less united? Before the Ukraine war, and at least until a few years ago, it looks like there are major processes that making the world more united, especially related to globalization, the global market and its effect, the internet that providing supposedly freedom of information across borders, international norms like the territorial integrity norm that we mentioned, and supposedly economic independence, growing economic, especially between China and the West, and the rising role of international institutions. The Ukraine war shows the major limits to all these global liberal mechanisms and their unifying effects on the world. Most notably, obviously, the failure of the United Nations. And not only the United Nations, but the UN Security Council is the organ, the international organ that is in charge of peace and security in the world. But the UN Security Council obviously cannot function with regard to this war because one of its permanent members, holder of the veto right, Russia, obviously is the aggressor in this war. So it means the UN is completely unable to function with regard to this war. So the bottom line is the war shows there are three camps that the world is divided into. One is the liberal West, and we show very clearly that all the liberal democracies in the world are united in one camp, including those countries that are far away from Ukraine: Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. All of them, together with the European countries and the United States and Canada, are in one camp. Who is the exception? Hungary and Turkey, two NATO members, and Hungary also member of the EU, but Hungary under Orban, obviously it's illiberal democracy, and Turkey, as Galia will point out later on, obviously it's not an example of a liberal democracy. The second camp is the authoritarians, China and Russia. We could speak a lot about the partnership between China and Russia and its limits, but still, it's a key foundation of the emerging international order. And we see another authoritarian state, Iran, definitely in this camp. Then we have the majority of the UN membership of the countries in the world that are in a third camp. The third camp that actually is in between the liberal West and the authoritarian, and even if many of them voted in the UN General Assembly against the Russian aggression, still are not full-blown behind Ukraine. And that includes most of the global South, and very importantly for our distinction, and also for the question about Israel identity after this tomorrow election, we see that all the illiberal democracies in the world are in this camp. We mentioned already Hungary, Brazil. Maybe now the election yesterday will change Brazil, but until under Bolsonaro, the illiberal democracy of Brazil, and also Modi, under Modi, India, all of them are in this non-aligned camp. On the one hand, condemning Russian aggression, but don't take any step, any actual practical step against the Russian aggression. What are the implications for Israel? The implication is really that we see the world is divided very clearly with regard to the democracies, let's say, between the liberal democracies and the illiberal democracies, and there are huge differences between them, not only internally, but also in their foreign policy. And the big question about Israel, what is the Israeli identity and Israel foreign policy orientation for the future? Will it be part of the liberal West, or is it part of this kind of non-aligned that include many illiberal, or all the illiberal democracies of the world? And that's important question also for the elections tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Benny. So we have about 15 minutes where we want to collect questions also from the audience. But before we do so, we have also the request basically from the panel to respond to the former speeches. And I think we will go in opposite order, or we will start with Sarah and then Alexander, so you can respond. And I will take the privilege of being the chair to ask you also a question that you can maybe implement in your response, from what we all heard. I think it was very good, Benny, now that you summed it a little bit up and put it in context. So maybe in your response, it would be interesting to know what you personally think. Are we in a new stage of a third world war? Is it a third world war we are talking about? Is it more a proxy war if we're coming from political theory? And Benny mentioned it in the very end. Our debate at the moment is still very Eurocentric, right? We didn't put the global South really into perspective. So if we're saying, okay, we are in a stage of a world war, we have an aggressor, and we have a country that is going to be invaded or occupied, but what about ongoing conflicts, for example, in Ethiopia, in Kashmir, this kind of debates that on a global scale, we tend to have this kind of Eurocentric perspective. So I would invite you for short responses, and Sarah can start. We will go along, and then afterwards we will collect questions from the audience. To the audience, please make it a question and introduce yourself. We will have a microphone that my colleague Roy will pass around, so you will have also, you will be heard. And Sarah, you will start with your responses.
I would like to follow up to Professor Miller's presentation. And in terms of the implications of this war for the state of Israel, Professor Miller rightly mentioned the critical importance of the tectonic shifts in the nuclear domain. The nuclear arms of today will become the conventional arms of tomorrow in the decade to come, and what we're seeing in Ukraine, both at the rhetorical level, but also in the nuclear preparedness of Russia, will have deep implications in the future confrontation between Iran and Israel. And I think for me this is the huge strategic takeaway of this war for Israel. The second one has to do with the question of legitimacy. Ukraine is a case in point of a country through the talent of its Nazi Jewish president that has succeeded in creating a sustained level of legitimacy in that war. And the question for us will be the third Lebanon war. To what extent will we be able to shape the legitimacy of our actions antebellum and during the war through our continuous exposure to civilians in what will be an urban warfare war? The third important aspect, Professor Miller, is the exposure. This has been the most transparent war of humanity, okay? Wars were transparent, but now they're completely transparent. What will be the effects on Israel's freedom of action in the next war, in particular in terms of the exposure of our forces to civilian intelligence, both from the satellites and from the civilians? Professor Miller, this war also has opportunities for Israel, lays out opportunities, and you've rightly mentioned some of them, The first one, you say, does Israel belong to the West or to the rest? I think this is a unique opportunity to reshape our thinking in terms of a regional superpower thinking, to sort of exiting the Cold War binary world in which we are dependent upon a great power rivalry, and to start and think in terms not of neutrality, but in terms of strategic autonomy. Another major opportunity is the revolutionary shift of the European Union, NATO, Germany, and Japan in terms of the defense and security postures. This creates a unique environment for Israel in terms of reshaping, redesigning its defense alliances across Europe and NATO. You know, Israel is allergic to multilateral alliances, and maybe the moment has come to deepen that kind of alliances, and also they could be translated into arms sales also for Israel. The gas. This war is also a huge opportunity for Israel to promote its resources and its new alliances across the Eastern Mediterranean. And Dr. Lyndon Strauss is going to talk about it, I think. So this is in terms of the implications of this war, the global ones for Israel. In terms of the debate on whether Israel should provide defensive or lethal arms to Ukraine, I would like to, you've very well laid out, you know, the different factors behind this decision. First of all, this decision is going to be made by the security establishment, not necessarily by the political one. This is a deeply strategic discussion. Second, I would like to take the debate out of the false dichotomy between strategies and values. I think this is a unique case where for Israel, a strategic interest clearly aligns with Israel's values, apropos belonging to the West. You've mentioned that we don't know what Ukraine wants. Ukraine is living an existential war. It's about survival, with Crimea, without Crimea, going back to the borders of 1991 or not going back to those borders, but Israel has to approach Ukraine through the lens of Ukraine fighting an existential war, regardless of the final borders. Second, what is the main debate? The main debate is not only about the narrow tactical deconfliction mechanism between Russian-speaking Israeli soldiers at the Kiryat and Russian-speaking soldiers in Khmimim and Latakia in Syria. It's about Russia and Iran, Russia providing advanced capabilities to Iran. It's about the Russian Jewish community, which is between 200,000 to 1.5 million in the Russian Federation. You have a very wide range. And on those two issues, Russia and Iran and the Russian Jewish community, I would say that the development is doomed, meaning that given the course of Russian political life, I'm not sure that Israel's action might protect or not protect in the long run the Russian Jewish community, whose destiny depends upon other factors. Okay. The second aspect is Iran. Given Russia's military fiasco in Ukraine, but the war can take another course in the coming months, we have an alignment, a strategic alignment that by necessity will crystallize. I'm not sure it's a good calculation to try and appease the Russians vis-à-vis the kind of capabilities they will provide the Iranians. If they have to buy drones to the Iranians, it means that Russia is in a keen dependency towards middle powers like Iran. Third, the deterrence goes by both sides. We didn't do any favor to the Russians in Syria. The Russians didn't do any favor to us, I'm sorry. The deterrence went both sides during those years. That is why I would argue that Israel should take this calculated risk of completely aligning with the West because it serves strategic and long-term interest for the State of Israel, the first of one being in the nuclear domain. We've seen that at the United Nations. To what extent Israel will be able to keep its freedom of action in the nuclear domain, given the fact that it's not an NPT member. And the second one is the question of legitimacy. And the Europeans and the Americans, whatever the majority that will be in the Congress, will remind Israel of Israel's actions. So I do think that in that case, strategies and values align, and you have a very vast array of possibilities of providing arms to Ukraine. The Iron Dome is not the question.
Thank you so much. Maybe the other respondents can be a bit shorter because we also want to take the audience. Alexander, you don't have to, you can. Maybe also Alexander has the question from Michael already, like what does the Ukraine want? Maybe as a short response.
No,
No, you,
willing to-
Alexander.
No,
you
put the
actually-
question.
This is not question, this is answer. I think that the Ukrainian war is a kind of proxy war, and I think that both sides, United States and general West and Russia, understand the red line of our side, and I think that anyway both sides should manage this conflict very carefully.
I'm going to give my question to the audience.
Yeah, I would like to maybe to highlight the point that you made initially about the power of nationalism demonstrated in this war. And again, I mean, the kind of the dominant liberal view before the war, starting after World War II and definitely after the end of the Cold War, that nationalism is a very weak force, declining in its importance, in its relevance in a global world, in a world that's becoming more and more democratic and liberal and so on. In the last decade, we saw the power of nationalism in many domains, including in the West, the rise of Trump, Brexit, the challenges to the EU in many European countries now, the new government in Italy, the 20% that the socialist democrat, whatever they called in Sweden. So nationalist populism became quite powerful. In the Ukraine war, we see it on a major scale. On the one hand, Russia, this offensive nationalism, namely the claim that your neighbor shouldn't have the right for self-determination. It shouldn't exist as an independent state because historically it belonged to us. And these historical claims are actually a key foundation of also Chinese nationalist claims beyond its boundaries, most notably toward Taiwan, but also in the maritime dispute and the conflict with India in the Himalaya. Also Turkey, in some cases, these historical claims about the Ottoman Empire and Turkey glorious past, and also in Iran to some extent. So historical nationalist claims seems to be a major destabilizing force in the current international order, and in many times they're also related to ethnic nationalist claims, like the claim of Putin that the Ukrainians are actually Russians, that they are no different, they are part of the Russian people, so Ukraine should belong to Russia. On the other side, we see the power of defensive nationalism. Many people suspected that Ukraine really doesn't have a strong national coherence. And indeed, the reaction in 2014 after the occupation of Crimea was quite weak, and there were a lot of questions about Ukrainian nationalism. But the invasion this year definitely showed the huge unifying power of Ukrainian nationalism, not only in the ethnic sense, but also in the liberal sense. Namely, that many Russians, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, joined their Ukrainian brothers and sisters in fighting against the Russian aggression.
Okay,
So,
Benny, maybe
in
let's
this sense,
open
we
for the
see this
audience. It's open. Because I see already that our coffee break is getting plundered and we're gonna have a coffee break. So we take 5 minutes more and 4 to 5 questions from the audience. Questions, please. State your name, and Roy is bringing the microphone. We start with the sir in the back, and then we will answer the questions all together, hopefully.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, thank you for organizing this. So my name is Pavlo Halic. I'm from Ukraine, but now I work at the Technion. So I have a few questions, but first I will ask the most important one, in my opinion. It's a question for Dr. Tabachnik, who presented the Ukrainian perspective. I think that this Ukrainian perspective is indeed, in fact, very Russian. For example, you use the Russian spelling of Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Even the Ben Gurion airport and Israeli media changed it to the Ukrainian spelling, which is Kyiv. And another more crucial thing that you said in your presentation, that the Russia does not want physically destroy Ukraine and Ukrainians, but Russify them. So now my question, so did you see the pictures from Mariupol, Chernihiv, Bucha, Izium, and numerous other small villages? For example, from Chernihiv region where I'm from. Did you hear about the list of Ukrainian intellectuals, politicians, journalists, and like artists, activists, which must be killed? It's thousands of people after Russia occupies Ukraine, which was published by US intelligence before February 21st. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Another question? We have one in the front row.
Yes.
And then one in the back.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Michael and also for Dr. Feinberg, and then a very, very brief comment. Michael, you say we have to wait for answers from the government before we can answer any of these questions. But the government itself really is just a conglomeration of scholars and diplomats and experts, right? Don't we have access to them? Can't we ask? I mean, the 4 of you and others as well, 5 of you and others as well. Do we really have to wait for the government to let us know what they think about each of these issues, the cost benefit? Aren't there people out there who have usable opinions and intelligent and thoughtful opinions that we should consult? My question for Dr. Feinberg, and actually this seems to be an assumption, that Russia has attacked Ukraine for the reasons I believe, and apparently you all also believe. It's all about expansion, it's all about history, it's all about restoring the Soviet Union, etc., and not at all really about NATO, the expansion of NATO, which was offered as an alternative explanation for the attack, that they were provoked by the expansion of NATO. I personally have never bought the second. It may have been a trigger, it may have been an additional provocation, but I also felt that the main reason was Russian expansion. And just a comment, I think America is very much on the verge of becoming an illiberal democracy. And I think in these next elections will determine this, and if the Republicans take the House, that's probably enough. If they take the Senate, definitely. But I think America's days as a liberal democracy are numbered. Very, very sad, very upsetting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to just thank you all for very informative presentations.
Okay. So the next conference should be on the US, and it's default. Okay, one last question from the back, and then we have the panelists answering, and then we do our coffee break.
My name is Avner Barnea. I would like to ask a question to Dr. Feinberg and Dr. Tabachnik. First of all, to Sarah, what is your explanation for the Soviet intelligence failure of assessing the strengths of Ukraine? It's now very clear that the Russians had a major failure in assessing the strengths of, maybe it was based on the Crimea case in 2014, so That's one question for you and for Dr. Tabachnik. The Americans and the British have shared a lot of up-to-date intelligence regarding the intentions of the Russians, including the day and the hour of the Russian attack, and still the Ukrainians didn't believe it, and when it happened, it was a major surprise for them. How you explain that they were so much asleep?
Okay, thank you so much. So, you would start? Okay, so I will get you the mic.
First of all, I want to answer on the first question. Of course, I know what was in Bucha, and I know what say Ukrainian intellectuals, but I must to mention that when I say physical extermination, I mention the cases like in Rwanda, direct physical extermination, 1.5 million people, and or Jewish Holocaust. So I don't think that Russia planned something of this scale. Death roll in Ukraine is high, but anyway, this not close to, for example, Rwanda, and I do not think that Russian government planned physical extermination of Ukrainian population. Yes, Bucha is a very painful case in our cases, but this is not. But this case cannot be defined as ethnic cleaning.
Sure. Unless you. Okay. No, Bill, I'll just address your question quickly. Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. In other words, the sources of information in a democracy, more liberal than less, is the public sphere. It's academics, it's the journalists, it's the government, it's policymakers, it's discourse, it's meetings like this. But what I'm struck by, and even someone who's kind of part of this discourse, I find myself unable to to form a firm opinion because I personally don't have the information that I need. So, for example, when Benny spoke, he spoke, in really one line, Benny, you mentioned Israel and you mentioned the Russian presence in Syria, and because of the Russian presence in Syria and the wariness Israel has, that explains Israel's reluctance to sell arms. I don't know if that's true. I mean, what does that even mean? Does it mean that what's going to happen if we sell arms tomorrow? The Russians are going to restrict our ability to fly, to shoot missiles, is that effective? Is that something that we need to keep doing on the scale that we've been doing it? So again, I raise the same questions. How important is that cooperation with the Russians? And what is the likelihood it's going to end if we supply weapons of one sort or another to Ukraine? Now, there's always going to be an element of uncertainty. And we have to live with that element of uncertainty. But I personally would like to know more from the sources that need to provide that information about whether that in fact is a valid reason not to sell weapons or give weapons or any other support, or what kind of support, or different sorts of support to Ukraine. Eventually, we're going to have to live with the information we have. But getting back to your comment about a liberal democracy, it's the obligation of the public sphere and the people who populate the public sphere, we know less than politicians, to provide that information and data that we need to make a relatively informed decision.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think the information circulates quite widely in the media, and you have a lot of senior members of the defense establishment who do lay out the information we need to make a decision. The first one is the possibility of Russia shifting its policy in Syria, that is to say, activating S-300 and S-400, restricting or complicating the freedom of operation of the Israeli Air Force in its Mabam operation in Syria. The second one is very well known, is the providing of advanced technologies, including S-400 to Iran, and the contribution of Russia to the Iranian nuclear program, and other means of strengthening Iran's posture in the area. The third one is very well known as well, We had it with the Jewish agency case, which is Russia blackmailing the Jewish community as a way to pressure Israel. We've had it in numerous cases before. So the dilemma is pretty clear. The consequences will be Russia, and Medvedev said it, like cutting its relations with Israel, shifting its policy in Syria, continuing in its rapprochement with Iran. The question is not what we don't know. The question is, what is the price that we're ready to pay to protect our strategic interests with the West? And I do believe that it is a paramount objective that should be pursued. And I repeat that here strategies and values do align. And by the way, Israel has already shifted its policy in Ukraine. It's not only providing defensive humanitarian assistance. According to foreign media, Israel is also helping in the intelligence field against Iranian drones, etc., etc. For myself, for me, the major risk is having Israeli technologies falling into Iran's hands. And I think this is a major risk that should be weighed in very carefully. In terms of your question, I think there was a question of a Ukrainian person asking about the massacre of civilians. It's important to say, as Dr. Tamachnik mentioned, there is no clear official instruction to bomb civilians and to bring arms to civilians in Ukraine. It has never been acknowledged publicly. It is, first of all, it started from a policy of limiting civilian harm to Ukraine. At the beginning, it was supposed to be a surgical, contactless operation. It shifted to mass artillery bombing of civilian population centers for a number of reasons. The first one is related to the limitations of the reconnaissance strike complex of the Russian army. The Russian army doesn't know to carry out strikes with real-time intelligence, and it does end up in massive civilian casualties. The second one, the Russian Federation, because of its fiascos at the operational and tactical level, decided to resort to its old tactic of ustrashenie, which is frightening the Ukrainian population, to create a level of influence of pressure on the Ukrainian government, to push the Ukrainian government to enter the negotiation, because the negotiations will enable Russia to shorten the kinetic stage of the war, which is very important because Russia is running out of arms. It also has another aspect, which is a punitive aspect, this is exactly what we saw after the bombing of the Kerch bridge. Regarding the intelligence failure, first of all, we're doing counter-history here, and we look smart at saying that, there was an intelligence failure. From my conversations with senior US and Ukrainian analysts, this operation could have worked. This operation, with all the misreading of the Ukrainian preparedness at the beginning, it could have worked should the Ukrainian civilian population, and especially volunteers in Kiev, did not react immediately. The Russian fiasco is a result of the massive volunteer mobilization in Kiev in the first hours of the war. The US and British intelligence agencies gave enough information to the Ukrainian side about the upcoming assault of the Hostomel airport. When the airport was assaulted by airborne Russian troops, there was no Ukrainian soldier to protect it. It started from the civilian volunteers who were able to retake Kiev and protect Zelensky against the prospect of a regime change. The second aspect, which is a very well-known aspect of the Soviet and the Russian organizational structure of the intelligence agencies, is the misreporting. Ukraine is full of Russian spies. I think it's one, Syria was full of Russian Soviet spies during the Soviet period. Ukraine is the most penetrated country by the Russian intelligence establishments. It was the most transparent country. In fact, before the war, Zelensky had a very low support of 23%. And the intelligence was collected and reported, transmitted by the 5th Intelligence Directorate of the FSB. And actually, it did provide the political establishment with the data, meaning very low support for Zelensky, deep divisiveness of Ukrainian society, not a lack of panic and preparation to the war despite the US and British intelligence, a shadow war, that lasted almost for a year, for 9 to 8 months before the war. But in those elements, when you think backwards, there were the two options. On the one hand, the Ukrainian public was prepared for that war, and on the other hand, the level of support for Zelensky was indeed very low, and the level of trust to this impending invasion was also very low. So I think it is not only a question of misreporting, it's also a question of interpretation by Putin himself and the political establishment of the intelligence reports that they had at their disposal.
Okay. I think we should really come to an end. We are already 15 minutes over time. You can take the question or responses into the coffee break. We will do 15 minutes coffee break with coffee cookies. We return here 12:30. I would like to thank all the panelists for the great job. And the next panel will reflect on the American, European, Chinese and Turkish perspective. We will meet here 12:30.